me go ahead and introduce our speaker tonight. Our speaker is Miss Natalie Mastick. Natalie received a Bachelor of Science degree in Marine Biology. She also received a Bachelor of Arts degree in Environmental Studies, both of those at the University of California, Santa Cruz. She also has a Master of Science degree in Wildlife Science from Oregon State University, and she's currently a PhD candidate in the School of Aquatic and Fishery Sciences at the University of Washington. So she has a tendency to drift northward. Natalie broadly describes herself as a marine ecologist, but focusing on marine mammal behavior, foraging ecology, and parasite ecology. For her PhD, she's studying the change and risk of parasite infections in marine mammals. Natalie's also a founding member and research associate with Sound Science Research Collective, where she studies humpback whale behavior in Southeast Alaska. Tonight's presentation by Natalie will be on humpback whales that are working together to bubble net feed and likely reduce the energy costs of feeding. Her presentation is based on a paper in Marine Mammal Science that I believe was published in the 3rd issue of volume 38, which must have been, I guess, probably the September-October issue last year. The paper is called The Effect of Group Size on Individual Behavior of Bubble Net Feeding Humpback Whales in the Southern Gulf of Maine, so the other coast. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Natalie and look forward to your talk, Natalie. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much, Daryl. Thank you for that introduction. That was really nice. As Daryl said, my name is Natalie Mastick. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Washington, and I'm going to be talking to you today about some research that my co-authors and I did. This was actually during my master's, where we were looking at how humpback whales work together in Stellwagen Bank in the southern Gulf of Maine. And as Daryl mentioned, this was published in Marine Mammal Science last year. So if you want to read the paper later, this is what you should look out for. So I wanted to start as far away from whales as I could, but with the context of why we did this study. So group foraging occurs all over the animal kingdom, and it occurs when the benefits of sharing food with a group outweigh the potential costs of group living. It's observed in many species, and it increases individual fitness by working with others. And it also allows individuals to obtain resources that would not be available to them solitarily. Like in the case of this group of African wild dogs, they are able to take down a much larger prey item than they would be solitarily. But this comes with some costs. The benefits to group foraging include increased detection and increased protection from predators. So if you were a shark trying to eat this school of fish, that if you were a member of that school, you would be able to detect that shark a lot more easily with so many searching eyes. And you would also be protected because it's more likely that your neighbor will get eaten instead of you. It increases the detection of patchy or scarce food. With that many eyes, you're also better at finding food in a patchy environment like the ocean. It increases a group's capture ability, whether intentional or not. It increases the ability to defend resources against others. And it increases the efficiency in exploiting a limited resource, which is what we'll be talking about today. The costs of group foraging include increased conspicuousness, both to predators and your prey. So this fish here is a lot less conspicuous than that school of prey, and it's less likely to get eaten by a predator, and it's less likely that its prey is going to notice it. It also increases the competition for resources. There are a lot more mouths to feed. And it increases disease or parasite transmission risk, which is what I study now, but we're not going to be talking about today. So group size can affect group foraging behaviors. And a variability in group size can represent different solutions to the same problem of procuring resources. So you can see here that a solitary lion is able to take down a calf. A larger group can take down a larger prey item, and an even larger pack of lions is able to take down an adult elephant. So group size can often influence the roles of group members. When you have a group larger than one, you can divide efforts in order to accomplish a bigger task. But the benefits of larger groups reach an asymptote pretty quickly. There's intra-group competition in which additional members exceed an optimal group size, and it becomes a detriment to individual success and fitness. And cheating becomes more common in larger groups, where cheaters exploit the efforts of other members in the group. So this group of lions might take down that elephant, but they can't necessarily fight off another individual from coming in and eating it without having participated in the effort to collect that prey item. So this is going to get a little bit into definitions, but one of the things that we are interested in looking at with humpback whales is whether or not they, what type of group foraging they're practicing. So group foraging broadly is the pooling of individual efforts to find and exploit resources. This can be a producer-scrounger relationship, as seen in baboons, where one individual might spend a lot of time finding a food resource, and then another individual will come in and take that without actually finding it themselves. This can be reciprocation, which is a type of temporary altruism in which one individual performs an altruistic act with the expectation that the other participant will reciprocate that in a future foraging event. And this is seen in chimpanzees, where one individual might find a cache of food, share with another individual, and then that other individual will reciprocate later on. There's also byproduct mutualism, in which individuals work together to increase their fitness without any evidence of altruism. It's also described as ordinary selfish behavior that's incidentally benefiting others. This includes group herding, which involves corralling prey into smaller areas, and it increases the density of the prey and reduces the cost of capture. But this is not necessarily intentional, and it can also happen with multiple species, as you see here. These are dolphins and penguins and seabirds, all working together kind of to condense prey into a smaller area, but that's not exactly their intention. So that's group herding. Then there's this golden goose that we see sometimes that we call cooperation, which is individuals taking on a role and restraining their own tendency to feed on their own and interrupt prey herding. And a really good example of this is killer whales that work together to create a wave to push a seal off of an ice floe, and then they collectively feed on that seal together. If any one of these whales went off and interrupted this to get that seal and eat it itself, that would be giving into their tendency to feed on their own. So they're restraining themselves, they're all working together, and they're going to share. There's also a type of mutualism called the division of labor. And this is when we see individuals performing different roles and making up a team. An example of this is in bottlenose dolphins. There's this feeding behavior in which one dolphin drives prey to the surface, and then these other dolphins are on the other side. They're barrier dolphins, and the driver forces the prey to the surface, and all of the dolphins are able to eat at the surface. And when there is role specialization, when individuals perform the same tasks for each foraging event, this increases the success of the team as a whole, because everybody's doing what they do best. They've adopted the same roles, and everyone gets the maximal fitness benefit. So where do humpback whales fit into this? Humpback whales are large bulk filter feeders. They are generalist foragers that feed on krill and small fish. They are baleen whales, unlike all of the odontocetes that I showed you in the previous slide. And they're behaviorally plastic foragers, which means they have a lot of different foraging behaviors that they can use depending on what prey they're going after and what area of the world they're in. They have several different foraging behaviors that you see across populations. In some populations, we see group foraging, and in even fewer populations, we see group bubble net feeding. Bubble net feeding is a really cool, if I'm biased, but a really cool feeding behavior that you see in a few populations, in which one or more whales dives below a school of prey and they release bubbles out of their blowhole and spiral up around the prey. And this creates a column that forces the prey to the surface because the whale is at the bottom. And then it ends in a lunge feeding event at the surface. And depending on where you see this, it is a solitary or a group foraging behavior. It's thought to be limited to about 25 meters depth, so that's where they would be starting. And it's believed to be a form of cooperative foraging. In either byproduct mutualism, where they are all working together and restraining their own tendencies to interrupt prey herding, and they all have a mutual benefit, or by reciprocation, where you would see one whale blowing the ring of bubbles and then another whale blowing the ring of bubbles the next time. So one whale's taking on more effort and then swapping with another whale. Those are the two hypothesized modes of cooperation for bubble net feeding. And Fred Sharp in 2001 in his dissertation supported this cooperation hypothesis. But the individual dive behaviors of the whales in the groups was not quantified. And that was the goal of our study, to see if individual roles within groups are different or changing depending on group size. So we measured individual feeding behaviors. And I can talk a lot about bubble net feeding, but I think it's better to see it in person. Well, not in person, but a video we'll have to do. If I could bring you all to one of these feeding grounds and show you in person, I would. But this is, let's see if it'll play. Yeah. This is a video of humpback whales bubble net feeding in Alaska. You'll see a group diving down here. And then on the right side of the screen, you should see a ring of bubbles starting to come up after all of these whales have dived. Here's that ring. And then you see this big aggregation of humpbacks lunge feeding at the surface. And it's really spectacular. It's amazing to see. Whale watching tours love it. And this happens in several different populations. So the places that were bubble net feeding were first documented were Southeast Alaska and the southern Gulf of Maine. But more recently, it's been observed in the Western Antarctic Peninsula, off of South Africa, off of Australia, and in Ireland. And we would expect the feeding behaviors, the bubble net feeding behaviors, to be slightly different in all of these populations because they're feeding on different things. So the population that I'm going to be talking about today forages on the Stellwagen Bank National Marine Sanctuary in the southern Gulf of Maine, and they are feeding on sand lance, which are a burrowing small fish. They burrow into the sand, and they are distributed in the water column during the day. So where do humpbacks fit into all of this cooperation? Most of these cooperative species that I was talking about at the beginning here, like lions and non-human primates and dolphins, they use groups for more than just foraging, whereas humpbacks exhibit less sociality. They're not as social of creatures. And if bubble net feeding is cooperative, it might be the only cooperative foraging strategy seen in baleen whales or mysticetes. They're also bulk filter feeders, which has a really long evolutionary history in the marine environment, and it's the dominant form of feeding in marine systems. And it's used by some of the largest animals in the ocean. And there has never been evidence of cooperation in other bulk filter feeders. So if this is a cooperative feeding strategy, this would be pretty out there. So we had a few hypotheses that we wanted to test to see what individuals were really doing in these groups. The first hypothesis was that individual feeding behavior is stable. So that is a qualitative assessment of the types of dives that individuals are performing in a bubble net feeding group and seeing if individuals are performing those same types of dives every time. Our second hypothesis was that whales are going to behave differently in different size groups. So this is testing whether or not an increase in group size is going to decrease the amount of work that these whales are doing. So is there an energetic benefit to increasing group size? And then the third hypothesis was whales in the same feeding group are going to adopt different behaviors. And this was to look at different roles in feeding groups to see if different whales were taking on different jobs within a group. So I did not actually get to tag any whales in my master's, but this is an artistic rendering of what that would look like. We approached animals that were bubble net feeding in a group at an oblique angle in our zodiac, which is called a rib. And it is specially outfitted to have this pulpit over the hull so you can get right over the whale. This is what it looks like when you're actually attaching a tag to a whale. You attach the tag to the animal along the dorsal ridge using a 7-meter long carbon fiber pole. And these tags are suction cup tags that stay on for about 24 hours using 4 to 6 suction cups. These are multisensory archival tags. We used D tags, Accusons, and CATS tags for this project. Each of these tags has 3-axis accelerometers and magnetometers, which are the same things that your phone has to show like where you are going in space. That's what a lot of Fitbits use to tell you how many steps you do. And these were sampled between 50 and 400 hertz. These tags include a pressure sensor. The D tags and the Accusons have paired hydrophones, so you can listen to what's happening while the whales are feeding. And the CATS tag has paired video cameras, so you can see a whale's eye view of what the whale's doing. They also are equipped with a VHF transmitter. That's that antenna that's sticking on top of the whale, and that's to get that's to help you relocate the tag after it falls off the whale to retrieve the data. So while the tag is on the animal, we have what are called focal follows. A zodiac follows the animal at 50 to 100 meters. And on board, there's a behavioral sequencer that identifies the whale and any associates and records behavioral information. They record the group size for every surfacing, the time of every surfacing, and when feeding events are happening and what type of feeding event it is. And then once the tag falls off, we retrieve that tag by locating it with VHF receivers. Once we have that tag data, we import it into a program called TrackPlot. This creates a pseudo track of the animal's movement using pitch, roll, and heading data. And we match this to the focal follow data to know exactly how many whales are feeding together at a particular moment in time. And if multiple whales are tagged together in a feeding group, then we can see what dives are happening synchronously. So we visually confirm all the bubble net dives that we see in the track. And this is what this looks like in TrackPlot. Let's see if this works. Yes, okay, so you see this little white whale, and this is performing what we call a double loop bubble net. So the whale dives around the school of prey, blowing some bubbles, comes to the surface, smacks the surface with its flukes in a lob tail behavior, and then comes back up for a capture loop. And this is only seen in still wagon bank. I'll show you that one more time. So it's going around and blowing a first ring of bubbles called a corral loop, coming to the surface, slapping the surface, which is thought to stun the prey, and then going back down for a capture loop. And then it lunge feeds at the surface. So there are 2 surfacing events in this dive. So one part of the dive type analysis was qualitative. We were classifying the dive type based on the shape of its track. We compared those dive types that were observed within individuals to test the first hypothesis to see if there was stability in individual behaviors. and to test the second hypothesis to see if there was differences in behavior based on group size. We also compared dive types observed within feeding groups for that third hypothesis to see if individuals were adopting different roles within a feeding group. The quantitative data that we extracted from these dives, we basically went into TrackPlot. We told TrackPlot where the dive started and ended based on that focal follow data. And we extracted sensor data from each dive. And this included data on 7 variables, including turning radius, which is depicted in this image here. It's the left or right turning of a whale. Pitch, which is the up and down movement of a whale. Roll, which is the over movement of a whale. The total depth traveled in the dive, the duration of the dive, the maximum depth achieved. And then we also calculated the fluking frequency, which was the number of flukes per minute that the whale was performing. And this is a measure that's commonly used as energetic expenditure. We then used a statistical analysis called a principal component analysis to create dive metric variables, because these 7 dive metrics were not necessarily independent, and that can be a problem when you're running models. A PCA creates new mega variables that basically put together all of the variables that are most closely related, and you can use those in your analysis instead. And we use this as a proxy of the complexity of the dives. So for our first hypothesis, we calculated the frequency of each individual dive types to get at that question, are individuals performing the same dive regardless of group size? So in this figure here, I've colored one of these whales blue so we can keep track of it over time. And we were trying to figure out if that whale was performing these double loop behaviors, for example, regardless of group size. We also ran a linear mixed effect model to compare dive behavior across group size to get at the question, are participants using less energy in larger groups? So this was essentially looking at, are whales in smaller groups performing more complicated dives than whales in larger groups? We also repeated this analysis for each dive type that we determined from the dive profiles and TrackPlot to see if dive type influenced the relationship between behavior and group size, to see if participants are using less energy in larger groups when using particular dive types. And for our third hypothesis, we were extremely lucky in that we were able to tag multiple whales that were feeding together synchronously in a feeding group. So we located the dives that were performed synchronously through focal follow data and TrackPlot, and we compared those synchronous dives and performed a paired t-test for each dive to test for the difference across dive behaviors to determine if whales in the same group are doing different things. So in this example group of 3, I've colored one whale teal and one purple, and we were trying to see if they were adopting different feeding behaviors or different types of roles in these feeding groups. So to figure out or to get closer to realize or to learning what type of group foraging is happening in these groups, I developed kind of a flow chart to figure out, to guide what the potential method of group foraging is. So we have the behavior of individuals within a group. And if individuals within a group are adopting different roles, if they're doing completely different types of dives, and both of those dives look like traditional bubble nets, then that is a indicator that this could possibly be a division of labor, possibly with role specialization if they're adopting those same roles every time. If we're seeing one individual that's performing a really classic bubble net and another individual that's not doing that, not showing any indication of a bubble net, this could be more of an indication of producer-scrounger relationship. If we're seeing similar roles within a group, and there's a difference between the solitary behavior and the group behavior, so if individuals are doing not completely different, but a different type of feeding behavior in larger groups than they would be doing on their own, then this suggests that this could be a type of cooperation. If they are performing the same thing regardless of group size, then that's more indicative of non-cooperative group herding. So that was kind of our train of thought when thinking about what type of group foraging we might be seeing in humpback whales. So we tagged 32 whales between 2006 and 2016. Well, we deployed 32 tags on 26 whales. So there were some whales that we tagged multiple times. We recorded 691 bubble nets, and group sizes ranged from 1 to 8, but the average was pretty low at 2.27. So usually around groups of 2 were happening in this feeding area. We ran this principal component analysis, and we found that the first 2 principal components accounted for 78.5% of the variability within the data. And what that means in a simplified way is that PC1 is describing change in depth, pitch, duration, and turning radius. And PC2 is describing fluking frequency, which is that energetic expenditure, roll, and maximum depth. So for the rest of the slides in the talk, we're going to think of PC2 as the measure of exertion because it has that fluking frequency and also has maximum depth, so they're diving a lot deeper. And PC1 is more of an indicator of dive length because we've got change in depth and duration. So we discovered several different types of dives in our qualitative analysis of the track plot. 2 of these were commonly recorded before in this feeding group by Wiley et al. In 2011. This was the double loop feeding behavior that I showed you in the track plot video, where the whale's doing a corral loop, coming to the surface, smacking the surface with its flukes, and then going back down around for a capture loop. Then we also saw these classic upward spirals, which is what you would expect to see for a bubble net. The whale is going down to depth and then spiraling up around the prey and then lunge feeding at the surface. We also saw some different variations of these types of bubble net dives. We saw upward lunges where a whale would dive to depth and then lunge upward. We saw half spirals, which were 180-degree rotations instead of the multiple 360-degree rotations. We saw single loops, which were kind of like the capture loop of that double loop behavior, but just one, and there was no lobtailing. And then we saw these really cool hybrids, which looked like an upward spiral into a double loop. And this was the most complicated bubble net dive that we saw. So in this graph, each color is a different whale, and you can see that the most common behaviors that we saw in this feeding ground were single loops and those upward spirals. Of the 26 whales tagged, double loops were seen most commonly in groups of 1 to 3, so smaller groups. Those hybrid behaviors were seen only in groups of 1 to 2. And the rest of the behaviors were seen in all group sizes. In our test of the stability of individual behaviors, we found that 88.5% of the whales performed one specific dive type a majority of the time. Specifically, 15.4% performed double loops for a majority of their dives. 50% performed upward spirals. 19.2% performed those single loops. 11.5% performed those hybrid dives for a majority of their dives. And none of them used upward lunges or half spirals for a majority of their dives. For our second hypothesis, if there's a difference in behavior based on group size, we found a significant relationship in PC2, but not PC1 across group size, and that was that exertion metric. So with increasing group size, we saw a decrease in the exertion that was used in that dive, but no change in the duration. And in these graphs, we have, group size on the x-axis and PC1 on the y on the left and PC2 on the y on the right. And each color is a different whale. For dive behavior by dive type, only upward spirals, so only the whales that were performing those upward spiral behaviors, showed a significant relationship in both dive metrics, so exertion and dive length, with group size. And we saw a significant increase in PC1, so an increase in the dive length with increasing group size, and a decrease in exertion, PC2, with group size. And we also saw these upward spirals across a wide range of group size. So there were groups of 1 to 6 in this feeding ground, and all of those group sizes performed this type of behavior. Okay, I'm going to spend quite a bit of time on the individuals that were tagged feeding together, because this is a really special occurrence that we were really excited to see. So there were 3 instances in which we had multiple tags. So we had 2 or more tagged whales that were feeding together in a group. Division and Nile, these are their names that we call them on Stellwagen Bank. In our paper, we called them their tag ID numbers, but that would be kind of difficult to read. So I'm just going to give you the colloquial names. So Division and Nile are 2 whales. They were tagged together in 2006. They were 2 of 3. So 2 of these 3 whales that were feeding together were tagged, and they performed 12 dives together. Entropy, Embroidery, and Mudskipper were tagged together in 2015. They were part of a group of 5, and there were 16 dives where we had tag data from all 3 of them synchronously. And Thumper and Ursa were tagged together in 2016. They were a group of 2, so 100% of that group was tagged, and they performed 7 dives together. So for Division and Nile, we found that their dive metrics were not equivalent. In these plots, we have each color is a dive number. So this brown line is dive number 12. That is the 12th dive that they did together. And there was a significant difference between the PC1 and PC2, so the dive length of Division and Nile's dives, and also a significant difference in the amount of exertion that was happening in those dives. And when we looked at the qualitative data on what types of dives they were performing, we found that Division was doing 100% just double loops. They were doing only those 2 loop dives with the lobtail. And Nile was performing a more variable array of dive types. So they were performing 58.3% half spirals. About a third of the time they were performing those single loops, and occasionally they did those upward lunges. So that was a significant difference in both the exertion and the dive type based on PC1 and PC2. For Thumper and Ursa, their dive metrics were also significantly different in both duration, PC1, and exertion, PC2. And similarly, Thumper was doing only double loop behaviors, and Ursa was doing something similar to Nile, where they were doing a mix of spirals and half spirals. And interestingly, this was a different case. So the trio, the Entropy, Embroidery, and Mudskipper, who again were only 3 of the 5 whales, we found there was no significant difference in the dive behavior for all 3 whales. When we did pairwise comparison, Entropy showed a significant difference in their exertion levels, but they were all performing upward spiral behaviors. Entropy was doing those 100% of the time, Embroidery was doing them 100% of the time, and Mudskipper was doing them most of the time. And you can see It does look like entropy has significantly different PC2, which is that exertion in some of these dives, because each color is a dive. And again, only 3 of the 5 whales in this group were tagged. So we don't know what the untagged individuals were doing, but right now it's looking like this upward spiral behavior might facilitate more similar behavior in the group. And what we saw earlier was that upward spirals showed a significant decrease in exertion over group size. So with increasing group size, there was a decrease in exertion and also an increase in duration. So that leads me to this flow chart again, because we saw something different with double loops than we did with upward spirals. So with double loop behavior, it looks like one individual behavior, the double looper, is influencing the behavior of the group. We're seeing different roles, and we are seeing evidence of herding in all participants. So that's not suggesting that it could be a producer-scrounger relationship. This might be circumstantial. This might be different in different cases, but we are seeing one individual doing these really complicated double loops and one individual is doing single loops, half spirals, that kind of thing, which is still a herding dive. So this looks like more of a division of labor. So this could be preliminary evidence that this is a type of division of labor in humpback whales. For the upward spiral behavior, because we see this decrease in exertion with group size, it looks like group behavior is influencing individual behavior. So with increasing group size, individuals are adapting their behavior based on how many individuals are present. They are adopting similar roles. And because we see that decrease in exertion, it does appear that there's a difference between solitary and group behavior, which provides evidence against non-cooperative group herding, and suggests that this might be more likely cooperative byproduct mutualism for this behavior. But again, we only tagged a few whales, so we would really need to tag a lot more members of a group to know a little bit more definitively. So for these behaviors in a feeding group, we found that most members adopt herding roles in feeding groups. In these pairs that we tagged, there appear to be roles within the group. Those double loop behaviors might be an example of a division of labor. And because we saw those in smaller groups, those double loop behaviors only were used in groups of 1 to 3, that might be a behavior that limits the group size. Maybe that one whale is so active that other whales can't really effectively get in there. The trio that we tagged, we saw them adopt similar upward spiral behaviors, and these behaviors decreased in complexity with increasing group size. So this could be an example of cooperation, and it might facilitate larger groups if whales are adapting to what other whales are doing in the group. So to do a final check on our hypotheses, first, are individuals adopting stable feeding behaviors? Yes, when we looked at the dive types that individuals were performing, it looks like individuals are adopting a dive type that they use repeatedly most of the time. Are whales behaving differently in different size groups? We found that exertion declines with group size in all behaviors. And with those upward spiral behaviors, we saw an increase in dive length and a decrease in exertion with that increase in group size. So they are behaving differently in different size groups. And are whales in the same feeding group adopting different behaviors? In all of the groups that we had multiple whales tagged, it appeared to be the case, unless they're performing upward spirals and then they're kind of converging on that same behavior. So in conclusion, we found a variability in the dive behaviors that are adopted in humpback whales bubble net feeding in the southern Gulf of Maine. We found stability in individual bubble net feeding behaviors across group sizes. Those double loops could be an example of role specialization or a division of labor, but that might limit group size. And upward spirals suggest more of a mutualistic relationship that could allow for larger groups. But again, we'd really need to tag all participants in a bubble net feeding group to know more certainly. And we're missing a big component of this because we don't know how the prey that these groups are targeting are different. Maybe these upward spiral groups are targeting larger prey, and that's a better foraging strategy for that type of prey. And maybe the double loops are better for smaller groups. Until we can incorporate that, there's still this big mystery. And with that, I would like to acknowledge my funders, the Pacific Life Foundation, the Ocean Foundation, Vogel Now Foundation, and NSF. My co-authors, Ari Friedlander, Dave Wiley, Colin Ware, Dave Cade, Susan Parks, and the Biotelemetry and Behavioral Ecology Lab. And with that, I'll take any questions.
Well, Natalie, thank you very much for an extremely interesting presentation. For me, I think you probably provide far more questions to be answered than actual answers to questions, but still very nicely designed study and some very interesting results. So I see there are a couple of questions popping up in the Q&A, so I'll just let Teresa handle those and go ahead and answer those questions.
Sure. Yeah, that was awesome. Thank you, Natalie. So Chris Gabriel asks, can you tell if those single loop dives are successful at prey capture? Does the whale open its mouth?
Hi, Chris. Yes, so based on our protocol for including a dive in our analysis, we had to have a visual confirmation that that whale fed. So based on the focal follow data, those single loop dives are ending in a lunge feeding event at the surface. Yes. Yeah. Thank you. That was a good question.
Okay, Thomas is asking, says, thank you for the excellent lecture, Natalie. I'm curious to know if there are acoustics involved in these feeding efforts. Is there evidence supporting the equivalent to callers, quote unquote, in this population? Thanks in advance for any insight you can share.
Hi, Thomas. That's a great question. So in this population, there is not obvious acoustic component to the bubble net feeding dives. This is very different than the bubble net feeding that you see in Southeast Alaska, where there is that calling behavior, which, if I'm correct in my knowledge of that behavior in Southeast Alaska, that sound that the whales produce resonates with the herring that they're targeting, the swim bladder, and it also amplifies in the bubbles. So it creates more of a column of sound, which is terrifying to the herring. We are not seeing a similar behavior in Southeast Alaska with calling, in the southern Gulf of Maine with calling. But it would be interesting to see if that might show up as the whales are, finding new ways to eat.
So I don't see any other questions showing up right now, but one question that crosses my mind is, did you have any information on your tagged whales where you were observing behaviors on either age and or sex, and whether there might be any hints at different roles for different ages or sex classes?
Yes, we did have age and sex data for the whales. We did not incorporate them into the model, but I think that would be a really interesting next avenue to look at. I also think that from personal communication with people that work in Stellwagen Bank, there seem to be whales that work together often. So it would be really interesting to incorporate more sociality into this type of study. Yeah.
Teresa, do you have any questions you'd like to ask? If not, I might come up with another question or two.
Well, actually, I think we just had one pop up in the Q&A. So I'll go ahead and ask that one first.
Okay.
Kirsty has asked, has there been any observation of bubblenet feeding in the Bay of Fundy or only in the southern Gulf of Maine?
That's a great question. I am not sure. I have been a little bit out of the bubblenet loop in the last year or two, but I know that from looking on Twitter, it seems like it's cropping up in new areas. So I wouldn't be surprised if it could show up in the Bay of Fundy, but I would have to look into that. Great question.
Okay, we have another one. For the whales that were tagged more than once on different days, did they still do the same types of dive behavior on those different days? I don't know if you looked at that.
I did look at this, and I was hoping somebody would ask me this, but I was also hoping that I could email them about it afterwards, because this is something that I included in my thesis, but I did not include in this manuscript. So I forget what happened. But I did look at that, and I would be happy to send you that answer over email if you could include your email in the chat, because I think that is really fascinating. And it's something I didn't mention in this talk. We were only looking at the whales' feeding behaviors over the course of 24 hours. I think it would be really fascinating to see if we could re-tag these whales and see if those feeding behaviors have shifted, if more whales are adopting perhaps that hybrid technique, or something that was a little bit more rare in this population.
Well, hopefully they'll reach out. This person is listed for whatever reason as an anonymous attendee, so maybe they chose not to give their name. But whoever you are, if you want to either post in the chat or you can reach out to Natalie directly via the contact information.
My email's up there. Let's talk about it.
Okay, we have another question from Thomas. He says, thank you for answering my question. If I might ask one more, I've observed a number of humpbacks that appear to swoop in and steal from other whales' bubble nut feeding efforts, coral and dome, for example. Did you by chance observe anything like that, and did it affect the behavior of the other whales?
Great question, Thomas. I'm familiar with both of these whales, and I know their reputation for being cheaters. I wish we had tagged them to see what other whales were doing around them. From observation, it looks like we get a lot of trumpeting behavior from other whales, and I don't know if that's enough to dissuade coral and dome from repeated interaction in those bubble nets. But I think from observation, it looks like those whales tend to be a little bit more fluid in their associations, probably because they are getting kicked out. But I didn't see this in any tagged whales, no, unfortunately.
So I might ask a question here that, if I understand everything correctly, which may not be the case, but so in your diagram, sort of designing what conclusions you might come to under certain conditions. So you had, if the behavior of a whale by itself and behavior of whale in a group together was the same, you would end up concluding that it was non-cooperative, evidence of non-cooperative behavior. But in fact, if those two things occurred and you could also show a reduction in exertion energy expenditure, some measure, could it still not be interpreted as potentially cooperative behavior that's reducing energy expenditure?
Yeah, so for that specific question, we were looking at the combination of dive type and that quantitative metric of expenditure because of exertion. Because for upward spirals, categorically, they were performing the same type of dive. in a group of 1 or in a group of 5. But with that decrease in exertion that we saw with increasing group size over all of the dive behaviors, but especially with upward spirals, that was enough for me to suggest that this would be an indicator of a more cooperative behavior, because you are performing the same type of dive, but you're adjusting it and reducing your exertion in response to the other whales that you're working with. Yeah, great question.
Great. I don't know that I see any other questions popping up.
I can ask
Teresa,
one on
do
behalf
you
of
want
the
to ask
students.
your sort of general question? We also got something pop up. Well,
Yeah, I'll ask my student one first, and then we'll address
okay,
Jeanette,
go for it.
or Janet, excuse me, the question. So I told Natalie ahead of time, we always like to ask on behalf of the students, right, as the student representatives here, do you have any particular advice that you would offer, whether that comes to getting the position that you've come to, or things that you've experienced through the course of your research, something that really stands out, or a couple things that really stand out? You're like, I really want to share this information with folks who might be interested in getting to a place like you are today.
Yeah, sure. I think my path has been linear in a lot of ways, but a little non-linear when you think of the topics that I've covered in my research. And a big part of that was taking all of the opportunities that I could. So my master's was with tagging whales, and then I worked with land-based observation of killer whales, and then I got interested in animal health, and now I'm studying historical ecology of parasites that infect whales. And I think my recommendation would be to find a niche that is a little bit unoccupied in the field. There aren't a lot of people looking at parasites in whales in the US, and so it seemed like an open lane for me, whereas the tagging felt a little bit crowded. And now I have become more of an expert in something that a lot of people don't know about. And yeah, I also suggest taking a break. Like it helps learning what you want to do and what you're interested in, and it helps reduce burnout, which is super easy to do in an academic setting. So yeah, those would be my pieces of advice.
Can you talk at all about when you're talking about finding those sort of unoccupied spaces, were you mostly reading papers or just keeping up with what was going on in the research or the literature, reaching out to people? Sort of how did you go about finding those areas?
Yeah, it was a little bit of reading and a little bit of experience. So after I finished my master's, I was working on a project studying southern resident killer whales. And I was reading all about the 3 main threats to southern residents, which are pollutants that are bioaccumulating, ocean noise that's making their habitat a lot more loud, and a reduction in salmon in the environment. And I was thinking about what other health stressors might be making these problems worse. And I kind of by chance met my advisor here, who's a parasite ecologist, and just thinking about that project or problem from a different lens by talking to other people in different departments and different fields allowed me to look at it from a different direction and completely pivot in my career. So I think, yeah, talking to people outside of your bubble is a big part, and getting some lived experience where you understand the system, but you want to understand it from a different way. Yeah.
It's wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah.
So we have a question from Janet. She says, sorry if I missed this, but is group bubble netting a commonly observed behavior in the southern Gulf of Maine? I worked there in the early 1990s and don't recall seeing it. Wondering if it's relatively new to that area.
Great question. So I think bubble netting, if I'm not mistaken, in the southern Gulf of Maine was first documented in 1989. And I think the first instances of that were solitary. So it would have happened since the 90s that group bubble netting has become more common. But those solitary bubble netters are still very common from this study that we did. Like group size on average was about 2 whales. So there were a lot of groups of 1. Yeah.
Okay, I don't see any other questions. I don't know that I have any other. Teresa, unless you do, we might just say thanks for a really clear and interesting presentation. Love the video footage. Made me feel like I was right there watching it. So really appreciate your paper in Marine Mammal Science and your presentation elaborating on it. So
Thank you so
thank
much.
you much.
Yeah,
You're
thank
welcome.
you. This has been a privilege. Thank you.
Great. I guess with that, we'll sign off. Be looking for the announcement for next month's presentation, unless Teresa, you have that in hand. You'll see it pop up on SMM website.
Yeah, we'll send out. I was about to tease it. Next month, we will be looking at a paper that talks about, well, speaker Tim Aubrey, looking at effects of commercial and artisanal fishing practices on behavior in bottlenose dolphins. So something a little bit different to look forward to.
But no doubt just as exciting.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay,
all equally exciting.
We hopefully will see you on next month's presentation. So that's all for tonight. Thanks for joining in with us. Good night, everyone.